Hi, welcome for WROC Online webinar. So we met today for 11th time to speak with inspiring people from Polish and foreign programming scene. My name is Karol Tomaszewski and I'm the host. In previous video, we speak with Mirek Burnejko about the public cloud. So if you did not seen this episode, you can find it in the video description below. So I encourage you to see it. Today, our guest is Omer Raviv, and he will tell us more about his awesome tool, which is OzCode, and everything what you need to know about debugging and all the details. So welcome, Omer.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yep. So I believe that you will show us more about the tool which we can use to be more effective in our job and to spend less time debugging and wondering why something is broken or not working as expected, right?
Absolutely. Debugging is just as I call it, the horrible 50% of our job, right? We all love coming to work, writing a cool new feature, refactoring, writing high quality code that we can be proud of. But there's the other 50% of our job where we're just, staring at the wall, like banging our heads against the wall, thinking, why do I deserve this? Why can't I fix it? And today I'll try and teach you many different techniques that will hopefully allow you to spend as little time as possible using the debugger so that you have more time for the fun parts of programming, drinking coffee, writing cool new features, the good stuff.
Yeah, I think that the debugging, as you mentioned, is not bad as a whole, but sometimes you are just stuck and you have no idea what is happening under the cover, under the hood, and it's good to know what exactly is taking place and how we can improve it. So any advice, how can we be more efficient at this would be really appreciated.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Awesome. So should I get my screen share up and running?
Yes, please.
Alrighty, let's start going through the presentation. I'll start by giving you some very quick heads up. As I mentioned, today we will be talking about Visual Studio debugging tips and tricks every developer should know. And so as I mentioned, my name is Omer Raviv. I'm the creator and CTO of OzCode. I'm very enthusiastic about .NET open source, and I'm just somebody who cares very deeply about developers being productive day in, day out. Before I take up an entire hour of your time, I'd like to explain why I would think to do that. And the reason is because I feel very strongly that every single minute that we spend using a debugger is essentially a minute that we squander away, right? As we said, we're not writing a new feature. We're not creating actual value for our employer. We're just fixing something that really shouldn't have been there in the first place. So today will be a very technical session where we will look at many different techniques inside of Visual Studio to find the bug much more quickly. I think there are only two ways to solve a bug. One of them, or to use a debugger in general. One of them is a complete and utter waste of your time, and the other is what I call having quality time with the debugger. And I think that this is an important distinction to make. Wasting your time using the debugger is what I call being in zombie mode. So it's very easy to see to recognize when somebody is just wasting their time using the debugger. If you walk past, you see them sort of staring like a zombie at the computer screen, and their finger hits F10, 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 and you realize they don't really know what they are doing. Whereas having quality time with the debugger is when I apply the scientific method religiously. So if I have a clear idea in my head what my hypothesis is, what my theory is of why the code is not behaving the way I expected it to behave, I'll have a very clear, thought-out debugging session. I form a hypothesis, then either prove or disprove the hypothesis, and then move on to the next hypothesis. But that's the only real productive way to do debugging. And of course, once we understand the scenario well enough, we can write a test around that bug to make sure that it doesn't creep back into the system. So I'll tell you a little bit about my personal journey as a developer. So I started out in medical imaging. I was working on the software that the doctors and the technicians at the hospital use to operate a CT scanner. And every few months, they used to take us out to the hospital to actually see how our software is being put to use. And I just remember having a very hard time because I was sitting there in the X-ray room, shaking, very afraid, thinking to myself, I really hope that this thing doesn't crash, because if it does, and we have to deliver a double dosage of radiation to that patient over there, you know, they're probably going to want a better answer than just null reference was not set to an instance of a variable, right? So I was very, very afraid. And that led me to the conclusion that the real challenges in debugging are equal parts intellectual and psychological. Because when we are debugging, we are often trying to solve the same problem for an hour, and then another hour, and then yet another hour, and we keep on failing at it. And that's why we go into that zombie mode of debugging. So to summarize the PowerPoint, and from here on in, there will be no more slides, just code inside of Visual Studio. Debugging is extremely complicated and frustrating and stressful. It's never planned. It's never accounted for, right? We never say, this sprint will take us about 2 weeks, but of course, there's the other 2 weeks, which will solve all these bugs we don't even know we have. And there's no way to quantify how much time that's going to take. And the only real cure for this problem is to know your tools. So to know the incredible power of the Visual Studio debugger, and to also know the incredible power of OzCode and other extensions that can help you on top. So I will open up my Visual Studio, and as I'm opening up my demo here, I'd like to ask you guys, because I'd like to make this session as interactive as possible, please feel free to write in the chat window, and our gracious host will relay some of your questions to me. So in particular, if you'd like to tell me what are the things that you find yourself struggling with the most when you're using the debugger. So go ahead and write stuff into the chat window, or let us know what are the things that you struggle with personally when you're using the debugger, and I'll try to address your questions as we go through the presentation here. So go ahead, write in your questions, and while you're doing that, I'll start going through some basic debugging scenarios and also show you how OzCode can help us make debugging more pleasant. So I often find that the things that people tend to struggle with the most when they're using the debugger is working with collections and complicated data. So OzCode has a lot of different things that it can give you on top of the normal Visual Studio debugging experience that can help you quite a bit in that scenario. So I will go ahead and hover over this variable. And you notice that the first thing you see is that this looks a bit strange because it's not the normal Visual Studio data tip window, it's the OzCode data tip, which actually adds a lot of power here. And I'm actually going to show you some advanced tips. For example, right here, I have a list of customer objects, but nobody bothered to implement toString on the customer class. So this is not very helpful. That I actually care about. So I'll select, for example, the full name and the ID, and you see how they bubble up to the top. And from this moment on, whenever I see a customer object, OzCode will always remember that full name and ID are the things that I actually care about. Now, I can even take this ability to the extreme. So let's say, for example, every customer has an address, and every address has a zip code, and I really want to know the zip code for each and every one of these objects, but I don't want to go and open each one individually, which would take me all day. So I'll just start the nested property, the zip code, inside the address, and then start the address inside the customer object, and now I can see the zip code at the top level, which can save me a lot of time. You'll also notice here that OzCode has this idea of a heads-up display for the debugger. So it's showing me all these different annotations right on top of my code. For example, here we have an annotation that's showing me what the current value in the for each loop is. And you'll notice that it's highlighting full name and ID because those are the things that I just selected. Now you'll also see that I have a search down here at the bottom. So for example, I can say, let's say there's a customer named Michael. I don't know where exactly Michael is inside this collection. So in version 3.5 of OzCode, we improved the search even further than in previous versions. So I just begin to type in the word Michael, the string that I'm looking for, and OzCode already gives me some auto suggestions. So it tells me there's a Michael E. Ford email address. And when I select one of these, OzCode will actually search through this entire collection, It's sort of like Control F in Google Chrome, where I can go through all the different hits that I have for the search.
Hello, Omer.
Is there a question?
No. Again, we've got problem with sharing. It was frozen for a second, and we could not hear you. So if you could explain how the search works once again, it would be nice.
Oh, okay, absolutely. So let's do that again. So I'm looking for a person named Michael. I type in the word Michael. OzCode gives me some suggestions, and I can choose one of these suggestions. And then OzCode very quickly goes through the entire collection and finds the particular object that I'm looking for. And I can go through all these options, or I can just filter this down and see only the fields and properties that match, that have the word Michael in them. So far, so good?
Yeah, looks really nice, just like as I would expect. I mean, very useful and very straightforward. So you can see just what you need, not all the information which you need to search yourself manually. So yeah, really nice feature. I like it.
Thank you. Another thing that we improved here is that after I did the initial search, OzCode indexed through all of the strings in this collection. So now I can also get some information about the quantitative nature of the information. So for example, you see that I have a gender property here in the customers collection. And when I type in female, OzCode immediately highlights and tells me we've got 12 hits for the word female. Or if I change this to say the word male, it will immediately update and tell me, oh, now we have 18 hits for the word male. So I get some information about the quantitative nature of the information. But there is yet another way where I can find that needle in a haystack inside of a long collection, which is to do a conditional search. So if I switch from doing a text search to a conditional search, I can now type in any predicate. So this is sort of like doing a link where clause. So object here is a special keyword which denotes the current object. It's a special OzCode thing. So I'll say obj.firstname.length is larger than 3, for example. I hit enter, and OzCode immediately searches for this entire collection, and it gives me all the objects that match the predicate. Right now, almost all of the objects, except for Ben here, have a first name that's larger than 3 characters. But if I change this to 4 or to 5 or to 6, you will see how the display here updates. And on my are the objects that match the predicate. Or if I change this to 7, it will show me, oh, I only have 2 people with a very, very long first name. And again, by clicking the filter button, I can narrow down the search to show me only the 2 objects that match the predicate. Okay, very simple, but very helpful. Okay, so now I'll show you a little bit more about this concept of a heads-up display. What do I mean by that? As you see, I'm about to step into the switch statement, and OzCode is already smart enough to tell me
so it seems that this screen sharing is not working very good and not as expected, because still we have some issues.
Oh, okay.
So, okay, Omer, you were talking about the switch statement, which is smart enough, and then the screen was frozen once again.
Okay, so let me again do that again, and I'll close down all these processes that were started when I restarted my computer.
Yeah,
and let's hope that everything works better. Okay. So again, we are on this switch statement here. We see that we are going to go here to this case clause, and so the other case clause is de-emphasized because OzCode can predict the future. It can tell me what's the next thing that can happen. So now, as I step through, you'll see that where this functionality becomes very helpful is when I have an if statement that's very complicated and probably longer than it should be. Let's say I wanted to know why this if statement is returning true. Well, if I don't have OzCode, I'd probably have to take each part individually, put it into the watch or the quick watch or the immediate window, and say, oh, okay, so this first part is false. I'll take the other part, also false. I sort of have to do all the Boolean logic in my head.
Yes.
Whereas with OzCode, I can just look at the colors. So everything that's red is false. Everything that's green means that it's true. And now I can very easily understand that this entire if statement is true because the last condition was true, and we have or statements in between. And that's also why the else clause is de-emphasized for me. Now, if I want to drill in, I can very easily click here and go over all the different items and see. For example, here we were comparing A+ to A+. Here we were comparing this number, which is not larger than that number. That's why this is false. And here we were comparing Visa to Visa. That's why this returned true.
So it looks really amazing. So it's just a matter of selecting the text, and you can see just like that all the information, what is true, what is false, and then you can see all the graphs with the all the tree with the breakdown, and it's really amazing. And it is supporting the C# language, or is there support for other languages?
So right now, OzCode only supports the C# language. It's built on top of Roslyn, which is the C# compiler. But we are looking into adding support for many other languages, including JavaScript, TypeScript, VB.NET, and many others in future releases.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I have in mind when I ask whether the JavaScript is supported or not, and because I believe that in JavaScript it would be really, really awesome to have this feature, because usually you are comparing with with JavaScript, we've got this problem with types and everything, so it's not so easy and obvious for everybody whether any condition is true or false, and there is also this falsy, truthy, tricky stuff. So yeah, but definitely this looks awesome in C# as well.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I get the request for an OzCode for JavaScript about once a day, and each time I say, you're absolutely right. OzCode for JavaScript is something that we are very, very interested in and hope to implement. One thing that you get on top of these colors as well is the integration with Visual Studio Edit and Continue. So Edit and Continue is, for those of you who might not be familiar, is the feature in the C# debugger, or in the Visual Studio debugger, where I can change my code while I'm debugging. Yeah, so and in previous versions of Visual Studio, like 2013, 2012, if you've been using Visual Studio for a very long time, you might remember that in previous versions, this functionality didn't work so well. Like if you try to change your code while you're debugging, oftentimes the debugger would complain if your method was an async method, or if you had any lambda expressions in your method. It refused to work. And then as part of the Roslyn project, or the rewriting of the C# compiler in C#, Microsoft rewrote the entire Edit and Continue feature. So now it works much, much better. There are a lot less restrictions. And so I can change my code while I'm debugging, and if I have OzCode installed, I will also get this experience called live coding. So for example, I will change this if statement now so that the first expression will return true. So I'll change this from a not equal to A+ to be equal to A+. Now, as soon as I lift my finger off the keyboard, OzCode immediately updates and tells me, oh, okay, so now the first expression is returning true, so we won't be evaluating the rest of this conditional expression. Or another thing that I can do is I can also change the value of my variables while I'm debugging. So I will go in and change the value of customer here to null by just double clicking on it and writing null and hitting enter. As soon as I do that, OzCode immediately updates again and tells me, oh, now we're going to have a null reference exception because the value of customer is null, and it's even highlighting in red the thing that's null. So that's another thing that you can do, and this is actually not an OzCode feature, the ability to change values while I'm debugging. It's something you can do in your debugger regardless, and it's very useful when I want to find out how the code would behave on a particular value. Now, one more thing I can do here with this live coding is I can actually now that I see that I might get a customer that is null and I want to see how this code would behave, let's say I want to add a null check, I can just do that very simply by saying customer is not null and customer.membership level, etc., etc. And now when I do this, I actually get instant feedback on every change that I make. So now I see that OzCode is telling me, okay, so now the null check will return false, and we won't evaluate the rest, so we won't have a null reference exception anymore. Okay?
Yep, really nice. And yeah, Omer, let me ask one thing, because you just presented the way how we can see the information about the collection and all the details about the data which we are debugging. And you said that the standard window which is used in Visual Studio is not used. There is some dedicated window from OzCode. And in standard window, one of the functionality which I like the most is that you can override the data which you have in your variable or collection or whatever. And is this something what OzCode is also offering, or is it somehow limited?
So sorry, I didn't quite understand. You mean change the value of what?
Let's say that you've got a variable, right? So usually we are with debugging, we are just want to see what is the value of it. But sometimes it happens that we want to override this value. So let's say that we want to change it from 10 to 12 or 15 or 20, whatever. And is it possible with OzCode as well?
Yes, absolutely. So let's see an example here. So
can you combine with this search which you presented before, that you were searching for some specific value, and then when you just find this value in, I don't know, with an object, can you change the rest of the properties of the object, or how exactly it works?
Okay, so you can combine it with the search at the moment, but you can change the values just as much as you can in the normal debugger. So when I hover over some variable and I go to some property, if that property has a getter and a setter, I can just let's say currently the maiden name is Kelly. I can go in and change it to Kelly 22222, hit enter, and it immediately changes. Right now, it doesn't work in combination with the search functionality. However, there is a different functionality that is very interesting in the scenario that you have mentioned, where I want to take the data that I'm seeing in the debugger, change it a little bit, and see how the program would behave.
Exactly.
And the way I recommend to do this is to combine debugging with unit testing. Because oftentimes, as I said, the best way to make sure that I'm using my time effectively in the debugger is if once I understand the bug well enough, I write a unit test or an integration test, or even just a throwaway console app which reproduces the same problem. Because then I essentially have the bug trapped in a room that has no doors and no windows, and it's got nowhere to escape. And then I can also play around with the information that I'm creating in the unit test and see how the code behaves in different scenarios. So one example of that, let's say that I've been debugging for 3 hours now, and I try to put a breakpoint here, try to put a breakpoint there. Eventually, I find that this particular customer object, this lowest, is the one that's causing a problem. And I want to create a unit test with the information from this object. So what I would do here is I would just go to this magic wand here. And the magic wand is sort of like the bearer of good news. This is OzCode telling me I have all sorts of useful things I could do with this particular object. And now I will go and click export. So when I click export, OzCode creates a textual representation of this object that I captured from the debugger session. And I can have this textual representation as either C#, XML, or JSON. So basically, OzCode wrote all the C# code for me. Now all I need to do is I can copy this to clipboard, paste it into my unit test, and maybe change it if I want to change it to try different values or different property settings. And then I can get up and running with my unit test much more quickly. Another thing that sometimes our customers like to do is, because we also have a JSON output here, and the JSON output is created using JSON.NET, the JSON serializer that most people use. Some people just like to use the JSON output, save it to a file, and then create a unit test or an integration test that reads the file, deserializes the data from the file, and then they can work more conveniently with very large object graphs that they want to play around with. Do you think that answers your question?
Yeah, I think that's exactly this is answered to my question.
Cool, awesome. Alrighty. So, by the way, do you have any questions from the audience, or should I just continue on with the?
So I think that we will cover this question, but yeah, basically the first question is how we can debug the link queries.
Okay.
Because I believe that this is the most case that a developer is struggling with. And the second question is, does OzCode supporting the parallel programs like multi-threading and stuff like this?
Oh, okay, multi-threading. That's a great question. So I think that the most relevant feature to talk about when we're talking about multi-threaded application is our trace points. And trace points is actually something that is not just particular to OzCode. It's a feature that has existed in the Visual Studio Debugger for many, many years. And relatively very few people know about it. OzCode has a feature called basically a trace points on steroids. So we take the Visual Studio experience of trace points and just give you a better UI for it. So I'll explain both the Visual Studio feature and how OzCode can make it a little bit better. So a trace point is just like a breakpoint, only every time I hit a trace point, instead of breaking into the debugger, it just writes some logging. And that's extremely useful for multi-threaded debugging, because if I try to debug a multi-threaded program using the normal way, which I know how to debug, which is to just put a breakpoint and hit F10, 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 that usually just doesn't work, right? Because what will happen in about 100% of the cases is that I hit F10 and suddenly I get a breakpoint on a different thread. And then I hit F10 some more and I get an exception on yet another thread. And it just quickly becomes a problem of trying to juggle too many balls in my head at once. So rather than do that, I can just create a trace point. So I'll show you first the Visual Studio way and then the OzCode way. So in the Visual Studio way, I just click on this button next to the breakpoint, which is the breakpoint settings. And then I choose actions. And it says, I'm going to log a message to the output window. And here I can put the trace point message. So I can say, for example, in this example, I have a variable, the expected delivery date. So I can say the value of expected delivery date is, and then inside the curly braces, which I open here, I can put any C# expression that I want. And then when I run this program, it will output all these messages to the output window. And you notice also that it looks sort of like a breakpoint, only it's a diamond, not a circle. That gives me the clue that it's a trace point rather than a breakpoint. So now I will use the OzCode version of trace points to solve this problem I have here. And the problem I have is that I'm now working for Amazon.com. And one day the boss walks into my room and tells me that some customers are getting the expected delivery date on their order confirmation email as sometime in the year 2020. And some are not. And we're not even sure why is this happening. So what I will do is I will just hover over the expected delivery date, again go to the OzCode magic wand and say create trace point with value. Now when I do this, OzCode automatically creates a trace point. It automatically fills out the trace point with the saying expected delivery date and puts in the expression in the curly braces. And here it gives me a preview of what my logging message will look like, which is very convenient because I can change this. So for example, I can say, give me the day of week, and immediately it will update and show me what my logging is going to look like. And of course, I can even call methods here. So I can say, add 10 days. I can do really whatever I want. Now, because I'm not sure what bits of information might be relevant, I can go and just add everything. And OzCode gives me a very easy way to do this. So I'll just go to the order and click on this button, add to trace point. So I'll add the destination and the ID and the item and the quantity. And you see that every time I click this button, it adds the things to my logging statement and adds them to the preview as well. So now that I think that my logging looks good, I just hit OK, run the program forward. And if you look at the bottom right corner of my screen, you'll see that these messages are coming in. And when I click this, it opens up the trace points viewer. And the trace point viewer is a fully featured log viewer that OzCode adds into Visual Studio. And so if with the question about multi-threaded debugging, one of the nice things is that I can see the thread ID here, and I can filter by thread ID. So if this was a multi-threaded program, I could filter this and see what each thread was doing at a time. Now, because I don't know, the only thing that I know about this bug is that it has something to do with the year 2020. I'll just type in 2020, and you'll see here that all these orders that are the ones in the year 2020 are the ones going to Paris. So that's really the power of trace points. I was able to add logging to my program while I was debugging it. I didn't have to stop, recompile, run it again, add some more logging, then again recompile, run it again yet once more, and then I was able to see the value inside of a fully featured log viewer inside of Visual Studio. And again, if this the big power is that if this was a multi-threaded program, I don't have to juggle all these millions of threads inside of my mind as I jump through them with F10, 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 F10. I can just read this linear depiction of what the program was doing one step at a time, which will make things much better for my small brain, which cannot contain all these many threads at one time. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so before we jump to the question about link debugging, I'll just show you one more feature. Again, because we've talked a lot about working with collections. That's usually the sort of things that people struggle with the most. So one more interesting feature that has to do with working with collections is the feature of comparisons. So in this example that I have here, I have a phone book object, and I'm serializing it into a memory stream, and then I'm deserializing it back out. And I think that there's some problem with this serialization logic, and I want to find out if there's a problem. What OzCode will allow me to do is it will allow me to compare two different objects to each other in a sort of like a diff viewer that we use for comparing objects and collections in memory. Only here I'm comparing actually objects and collections inside of my C# application. So I go to the phone book object, I click this button, compare this, and now OzCode asks me, what do I want to compare this phone book to? And it's highlighting loaded phone book, because OzCode knows that I can compare any two objects that are the same type or derived from the same type. So I'll go and compare phone book with loaded phone book. Okay, and I hit compare. And now OzCode immediately shows me these two objects side by side. So I see the original phone book and the one that we just serialized and deserialized. And I can immediately see the problem. So I see immediately that the original phone book has proper ages, and here the ages are all 0. So I probably just forgot to serialize the age property. Okay. The other thing that we see here is that it shows me the fields and properties that are different in red, and the ones that are still the same in black. I can also filter this down to say, only show me fields and properties that are different by using this checkbox here. And another very nice thing is that if I have two string properties that are very long, like XML or JSON documents, I can click this button right here, and this will open up the two strings in my favorite diff viewer. So for me personally, I like to use beyond compare, which is I like to use a lot. But if you prefer a different diff viewer, you can configure this through the OzCode options dialog. So that was a little bit about making comparisons between different objects and collections, something that can help us figure out the problem in complicated bugs where something changed, but I'm not sure exactly when and where it changed. Quite a lot of our bugs have to do with different mutations in our code. Now, let's jump ahead and refer to the question about debugging link queries. One of the things that I personally felt very troubling as a C# developer is that I often felt that working with link is sort of like making a big sacrifice. Because when I write my code in this nice link style, in long link queries, I essentially sacrifice the debuggability of my code for its readability. I get code that is a lot more nicer to look at. It's more readable, more succinct, more maintainable, more declarative, and just easier to work with. But if I try to debug a big LINQ query like this one, when I hit F10 over it in the debugger, it either finished or it threw an exception, but I have no idea what actually happened inside. And so what we did in OzCode is we tried to create a feature so that the more you use LINQ and the more functional, more beautiful style of C# programming, it will actually be easier to debug instead of harder to debug. So I'll try and show you how that works. So in this example, I have a very beautiful poem, very artistic, that I wrote, and I will now sing it for you. It goes 99 little bugs in the code, 99 bugs in the code. Take one down, patch it around, 127 bugs in the code. Repeat until no more bugs. And I think my singing is improved because I've been showing this demo a lot. I hope you appreciate that. Yep. And here we have a beautiful LINQ query that's trying to find what is the word that appears most frequently inside of this poem. And OzCode is telling me that we have a mistake because we were expecting this LINQ query to return the word bugs, but it's actually returning the word code right now. And so I'm going to go back and see what the problem is. Now, we see that the word bugs appears 1, 2, 3, 4 times. And the word code actually appears only 1, 2, 3 times. So this definitely should have been the word bugs here. So I'm going to go back. And the first thing you notice is we have these numeric indicators that are telling me how many items came from each part of the LINQ query. Now, these numeric indicators are actually part of the live coding feature that I showed you before. So if I change my code, my LINQ query with edit and continue, these numbers will update in real time. And I'll show you this in just a moment. But the first thing I'll do is I just click on one of these indicators. And now I'm inside a LINQ debugging mode. So inside LINQ debugging mode, we see that we get a visualization of how every item passed through the LINQ pipeline. So for example, we begin with 99, which is the first word in our poem here. And we see that 99 came from split. Then the where clause returned true. That's why it's green. Then we group by the word itself. And then we order by how many times it appeared in the poem. So we see that 99 appears 1, 2. That's why this lambda expression returned the number 2. So we order by the count. And then we take the last one because we want the most frequent word. Now, inside LINQ debugging mode, I can basically go to any item here and see what happened to it. So for example, if I select this string empty, I see that the where clause returned false, and that's why we didn't continue on to the rest of the LINQ pipeline. Or I can go to the where clause, and you can see that I can see the before or the after of the operator. So I can see the 79 items that came in or the 29 items that came out. And when I look at these guys, the red and green indicators here on the right-hand side tell me whether the predicate returned true or false for each one of these items. Okay, so we still haven't solved this bug. We're going to need some more information. So for that, I will go and open the LINQ analysis window, which I can open either by clicking this button right here or open this button here as well. And when I open the LINQ analysis window, it basically allows me to zoom in on one particular operator. So for example, right now I'm looking at the group by clause, and it's on the left-hand side, I'm seeing all the items that came into group by, and on the right-hand side, I'm seeing all the groups that came out. So very easy to see the connections, the before and after. So the only thing I know about this bug, again, is that it has something to do with the word bugs, right? We were expecting the word bugs to be the most frequent word, but we got the word code instead. So I will do a search for the word bugs, hit enter. Again, I will filter this down with the filter button. And now I can see exactly what the issue is. I can see that I have these 3 instances of the word bugs going inside of this group, but I have another instance of the word bugs going to a completely different group. Okay, so I actually have 2 problems here if you look very close. first I need to take care of the casing issue, right? I don't care if it's lowercase or uppercase, it's still the same word. If you look closer, you also see this closing parenthesis at the end that we forgot to take care of. So I will exit link debugging mode, and now I will solve this problem with the live coding. So you see that right now I have 79 items coming from split, but as soon as I add the missing separators, the open parenthesis and the closing parenthesis, whoop, now I have 81 items coming from here. And you also see that right now I have 19 items coming from the group by because the lowercase and the uppercase went into different groups. So I get 19 groups. But I will fix that by saying select I goes to I to lower, and ta-doom, now we have 18 items coming from here. So now I just hit F10 and I see that we fixed the problem. Woohoo!
Yeah.
Okay, so that was the first part of debugging link queries.
Okay, so we've got one question from our audience. The question is, can we do the similar thing when we are working with databases? So the case is that we are creating this query using the linku, but then we are not querying some objects in memory or some collection in memory, but basically our source is a database. So is there any difference for OzCode? Is it still possible, or how exactly it works?
Okay, so that's a great question. So the answer is that yes, as long as you are using the latest version of OzCode, the 3.1, that we added support for iQueryables. So if you are working with a link to SQL or link to entity framework or any sort of iQueryable, any sort of link to database language, it will work. But there is something that you need to be aware of, and that is just the amount of information that you are working on. So let's say, so it will work exactly the same. If you will get these indicators, the only difference is that rather than having numbers here, you will get a question mark because OzCode doesn't want to go to the database without you approving it. So you will see a question mark instead of a number, and when you actually click on the question mark, you will get the same exact experience that I showed you, where you can see all the values and see all the flow of the query. The one thing that you do need to remember is that if you're working with a database table that is very large, things might go slow. So let's say, for example, that let's imagine that split here was actually a database table that has 20 million rows. We probably don't want to have all those 20 million rows going into our memory just so that we can enjoy the OzCode visualization, because our Visual Studio will explode, right? So what we recommend to do in this case, let's say that split here was something that is a database table that has 20 million rows, but after the where clause, we only have something manageable, like let's say a few thousands. What we recommend to do is to simply add a tool list here. When we add a tool list, what will happen is that OzCode will only show you visualization for the part after the tool list, converting from iQueryable to IEnumerable. And if the part after the tool list only has, you know, a few thousands or tens of thousands or 100,000s, it will still be fast enough that I can enjoy the visualization, even though the original database table might be huge. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it means, if I understand correctly, that the data won't be visualized as long as you do not materialize the query, right?
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
So after you do the tool list, it will only show you the part after. Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely. Okay. So actually, I have a question for the audience. Let's see. Let's try and do a little survey to make things interesting here. Since we're there, everyone seems to be very interested in link. I'd like to know, do you personally, and does our audience, do you prefer to use the a query syntax of link, like we see down here below, or the fluent syntax of link, like we saw in the previous example, or like we see up here with the lambda expressions? Which one do you like better?
So, okay, I can say from my perspective, from my experience. So usually I prefer linku way to express the queries. However, the second one is useful when I'm trying to do the join, because I believe that join is much easier to express with this query approach than with the standard one. But as long as I do not need a join mechanism, then I'm usually going with this previous one, which I believe is more fluent and easier to read from the developer perspective.
That's really insightful. I also tend to agree. What does our audience say, or do we also already have some answers from the audience? What is the consensus there?
So we've got still some answers, but we need to moderate them a little bit. So I think that in a second or two, so basically the judgment from audience is that fluent is better, right? So usually people prefer the fluent way to express the queries.
Yeah, so this is very interesting. I think usually when I ask this question, about 95 or 90 to 100% of the audience tell me that fluent is just better, and they usually prefer to use fluent. But much like you said, the reason I like to show this example is because I find that in some cases, the query syntax is actually a lot better. So let's see one example where I will try to convince you that in this example as well, the query is much better. So what I'm trying to do in this example, I'm saying I want to find all the best students in the university. So I'm saying from each department, so I have math, biology, physics, etc. I'm using the let keyword, which is actually one of my favorite keywords in the C# language. It's very functional, very mathematical, right? So I'm using let to say, let's calculate the department average, which is the average grade of all the students inside the department. And then from each student in the department, give me just the ones where their grade is above average within their department. And then select out just the names of those good students. So I could probably do the exact same thing in the fluent syntax, right? Because having two froms, like I have in here, is just like doing a select many in the fluent syntax. And using the let keyword, as I'm doing here, is just like doing a select with an anonymous type. Actually, that's what the compiler is translating that to anyways behind the scenes. But I think you'll have to agree that probably this up here is, it's not the best. And this down below is actually very nice. It's taking a relatively complicated idea and expressing it in relatively very few lines of code. Now, the good news is that the OzCode link debugging experience will work just the same when we're using the query syntax or the fluent syntax. So just to demonstrate that, I will click again on one of these annotations. Now, of course, nobody bothered to implement toString on the department class, and nobody bothered to implement toString on the student class either. But that is no problem. We will just go and select the fields and properties that we care about. So for the student, I think I want to see the grade and the name. And for the department, I'll try to select, for example, the ID and the name. Voila, now I can actually read through this query. Or I can go to the where clause, again, see who the good students were, who the bad students were, and by just clicking on one of them, see the flow. So for example, we see that in the mathematics department, the average grade was 44.8. Unfortunately, Barbara was not such a good student this year. She only got a 38. So the where clause returned false, and that's why she wasn't included in the list of good students. But if I compare it to, let's say, Brett here, we see that in physics department, the average was 45.4, and Brett here got 59. So the where clause did return true for him, and he is included in the list of good students. Now, one more advanced feature in the link analysis window here. So just to repeat, the link analysis window shows me the before and after of each operator. So for example, while looking at the where clause, on the left-hand side, it shows me all the items that went inside the where clause, the before, and on the right-hand side, it only shows me the items that match the predicate, so the after. If I go to the select, which is this select clause down here at the bottom, this takes in the student object and just selects out the string that represents the name of those good students. Now, let's say I wanted to know for each one of these good students what department they came from originally. So for that, we have this little pin button up here. So the pin button will allow me to select any chunk or sub-segment of my link query and see the flow of information inside that chunk. So I could pin to here or here or here. I'm actually going to pin all the way back to the very beginning of my query. So now when I hit the pin button, what I'm seeing now on the left-hand side, I'm seeing the departments that came in from the very top of my query from here. And on the right-hand side, I'm seeing just the students, that the names of those good students that came from the very bottom of this query. So that's what the link analysis Windows pin button will allow me to do. It is sort of like debugging SQL statements in the way we did it in the old times, where you take a SQL statement and you chop it down into smaller parts. But now we have a much more successful way of doing it with just one click. Okay, so that was debugging link queries. Awesome.
So I think that this is like a must-have tool, because usually when you are writing a link query, then you need to keep everything in your head, and you need to understand what exactly is going on, how it works. And with this tool, you can just see step by step what is going on, how it works, what might be the problems. It's something amazing, really.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah, this is definitely, for me, the feature in OzCode that I love the most, because it just takes a programming practice that is difficult and makes it easier for novices as well. So, for example, if you go online and you Google visual link lexicon, you will find that people are actually using the link debugging features to teach a link. So for example, in this article, you have an explanation for each and every link operator, and the visualization they chose to use to explain each operator is using the OzCode visualization. So for me, this is the thing that warms my heart the most, is to see that people are using some of the OzCode features, not only as a tool for professional programming, but also just as a tool for learning. So that definitely brings a smile to my heart.
Yeah, I can imagine that this could bring a great educational flavor to the tool. It's really nice to see that now you can see just all the details, all the step-by-step cases. It's fantastic.
Excellent. Awesome. All right, cool. So I think we're, should we take some more questions from the audience?
So I think that at the moment we have none. Probably they will appear during the presentation. And yeah, going back to the link, I think that this is also good to mention that usually people are splitting the queries into smaller parts, because they don't want to deal with the big one, because they feel that it's hard to debug, how to see what exactly is going on. And with your tool, this is no longer an issue, because yeah, you can just see everything what is needed. So this is really nice.
Yeah, I see quite a lot when people struggle with link debugging. Sometimes they go to extreme lengths to solve the problem. Like as you said, they go and rewrite the entire link query as just a bunch of for each loops, just so that it will be easier to debug, which is really unfortunate, because then we are just doing work to please the debugger, right?
Yep, exactly. So I saw many times that people were doing exactly what you said, that sometimes the code was very precise and very strict, and then when they have problems with debugging, they were just splitting it to see how exactly it works. And as you said, this is unfortunate, because yeah, we introduced those tools and these features into the language, and then during the debugging, we just need to go back and turn it to the previous approach. So usually it happens as you mentioned, but yeah, with your tool, it's totally different approach.
Cool. Okay, so how are we doing with time? Do we want to see a preview of the next version of OzCode? Do we want to take some more questions?
So as I mentioned, at the moment we have no question from audience, so I think that we can go forward and see the next awesome features which OzCode offer.
Okay, perfect. So For the next demo, I will show you a preview of two new technologies. One is a new technology that is coming out as part of Visual Studio, which is Visual Studio Live Share. And I will also show you a preview of time travel debugging, which is a feature in the next version of OzCode, version 4, which is coming out later this year. So after we released the link debugging functionality, we started to think about how can we give you the same compact debugging experience that the link debugging feature gives you for normal code, right? For each loops imperative style programming. So as an example of this, I have exactly the same problem that I had before. So I already totally spoiled this demo for you. You already know the answer because this is exactly the same demo. Only here I have the same problem, but solved in an imperative style of programming. So I have my poem that I wrote, and I have, again, I am taking all the words, splitting them splitting the poem into words, and then I'm for each over all these words, and I'm maintaining a dictionary for each word, how many times it appears in the poem. So if it's already in the poem, I just +1 it. If it's not already in the dictionary, I initialize it to 1. And finally, I make sure that the answer is the word bugs. So as I showed you before, when I run this code, you will see that OzCode shows me that we got this wrong. This currently returns the word code. So what I will try to do now is I will try to debug this, but I'm not so familiar with this code. I need some help from a friend who maybe understands these codes better than me. And for that, we have the Visual Studio Live Share technology, which is a new technology from Microsoft for collaboration. What this means is that it's sort of like Google Docs for your Visual Studio IDE. So if you're familiar with Google Docs, where I can share a document with somebody else and then they can join into my debugging session or my code editing experience, it's the same exact idea. So what I will do is I will put this Visual Studio now on the right-hand side, and I will click on Share, which says Start Collaboration Session. When I hit Share, it will give me a link, invite link, which I can copy to my clipboard, and then I can send it over email or Slack or whatever I like. And then the other person from a different computer, so let's pretend that on the left-hand side of my screen, I'm on a different computer and I'm somebody else. And then I can click Join Collaboration Session, okay? Well, what that does, I can now paste in the link that my colleague gave me, and it will connect to his Visual Studio, okay? And what you will see now is something very, very magical. So it takes a few seconds to load up, but now I am connected to the other machine, and this machine on the left-hand side doesn't necessarily even has all the same source code or all the same features that the person inviting me has, okay? Actually, they even support inviting someone from Visual Studio Code to join a collaborative debugging session in Visual Studio. And now that I've joined the collaboration session, I can see the breakpoint that I am on, I can see all the code, and I can also see the new OzCode time travel debugging features, okay? So as I mentioned, when I select some code on the left side, my colleague can see where my caret is. So it's the same exact experience like a Google Docs. I can write a comment. Hi, how are you? And as I type it, they can see exactly what my changes were. It's very, very easy. Now, the next thing that I will show you here is that I can so let's look in this Visual Studio. OzCode version 4.0 gives me a time travel debugging experience for normal loops. So I will now solve the same bug that we saw before with this poem, but I will solve it using the time travel debugging experience. So again, we see that I for each over all the words in the poem, and next to this for each loop, I have an indicator telling me that I have entered this for each loop 79 times. When I click on any of these iterations here, OzCode time travels to that particular iteration. So if I time travel to iteration number 55, I see that that word is the string empty, and that because of that we didn't go inside of this if statement. So we didn't care about this particular one. Now I know that this bug has something to do with the word bugs, like we saw before. So I will just search for the word bugs, like so, hit enter. Now OzCode actually shows me that in this for each loop, there are 4 iterations. The second, 8th, 46th, and 78th iterations had the word bugs in them. When I click on the first iteration, I see that in the first iteration, we initialize the value in the dictionary to be the number 1. On the second iteration, as we expect, we update the value in the dictionary to be the number 2. On the third one, as we might expect, we update the value in the dictionary to be the number 3. But on the fourth iteration, we had the same problem that we saw before in the link example, where we have 2 problems. This one is uppercase, but the other ones were lowercase. And we also need to take care of this closing parenthesis at the end. So let me please fix this problem now, but I will fix this with live coding. So you see that right now I have 79 items here. But as soon as I add the open parentheses and the closing parentheses, you see that both collaborators can see the change, that now we have 81 items coming from here. Okay, so I'm making changes on the left-hand side of my screen, which is the guest that joined the collaborative debugging session. But on the right-hand side, every time I write any character in my code, the other person can see it immediately. Now, the only thing we need to do still is to change this to, say, to lower, because we see here we still haven't solved the problem, right? The assertion is still false. If I time travel and go to the uppercase word bugs, I see that it's still here and it's still in uppercase. So I will add the to lower. And as soon as I do that, you will see that, voila, the assertion now became green, both for myself and for my colleague, and we worked together to solve this bug. Okay, so this was a brief introduction to both Visual Studio Live Share and time travel debugging coming in the next version of OzCode. Awesome.
So this feature is not available yet, but it will be in the near future, right?
Yes, absolutely. So Visual Studio Live Share is already available as a private beta, so you can request an invite, and once your time comes, you get an invitation from Microsoft, and then you can also already start using it. The extension is already publicly available in the marketplace, and the OzCode features for time travel debugging are part of OzCode version 4.0, which will be coming out as an early access preview in the next few months.
Okay, makes sense.
Cool. And for me personally, the thing that I think is the most exciting thing about collaborative debugging with Visual Studio Live Share is the fact that it is a lot more powerful than just screen sharing. Because when we are doing screen sharing, I can do one thing as the person driving, and the other person can just look at what I'm doing, and they can't do much, right? With Visual Studio Live Share, when I look at my Solution Explorer as we are debugging this problem, if I want to go and see some other files that are related to the problem that we are trying to solve, I can just go and look at them, and the other person can still be here. He can do whatever he wants, but while I am looking through some other files, trying to get more information. And if I run the program forward, you see that we immediately sync up, and we immediately see where the breakpoint took us. Now, finally, another thing that's very nice about this is that we can multitask. So when I time travel to a particular iteration of the loop, I get to see what happened inside this iteration of the loop. So I time travel to iteration number 4. Now when I hover over the variables here, I get a data tip that shows me what are the values that are relevant to the 4th iteration of the loop. And at the same time, my colleague can go to some other iteration in the loop and see what happened there. So here, for example, my colleague can be on the 19th iteration while I am on the 4th iteration, and we can multitask and each go research something else.
So yeah, it looks really nice. And so I assume that if you want to cooperate with with debugging, the assumption is that you need to have exactly the same source code. Is that right?
Actually, no, and this is one of the most exciting things. I don't have to have your source code at all. When I connect to your Visual Studio, I can see your Solution Explorer, but I did not download all your source code. It's only when I actually go into some file that it fetches that source code from your computer as you are the host. So all we need to do to start collaborating is for you to send me the link for that you got when you started collaborating session, and that's it. I don't need to have your source code. I don't need to have the same Visual Studio version as you. As I mentioned, it even works if you have Visual Studio and I have Visual Studio Code, and that's another very big advantage, because let's say I am one of those people that only wants to work in dark theme, and you hate dark theme and you can't work with dark theme. There we go. It solves all our problems. I can use my Visual Studio with my extensions, with my color schemes, with all the things that configured the way I like to use them, and you use your Visual Studio, and we are working on the same solution, only I am remotely connected to your solution and to your debugger.
So it seems that the only thing which you need to have for the cooperation is Visual Studio installed, right, with the OzCode.
Well, yeah, for live share right now, the only thing you need to have installed is Visual Studio and the live share extension, which you can get from the Visual Studio Marketplace. And as I mentioned, you can sign up from the private beta, and once you get the invite, you'll also be able to start sharing with people.
Okay, yeah, it looks really amazing, and the thing that you don't have to have the source code, for me, it's really something totally new. So you can be just a consultant and have just the Visual Studio, and everybody who has any issue with debugging or whatever, he can just ask you for advice, and with just a second, you can see all the problems, and you can say, okay, so here is the problem, and we can solve this or that. And I really like that, and I think that this has a potential to be a very appreciated feature.
Absolutely. In my opinion, this is one of the best things that Microsoft has released in recent years. It opens up so many scenarios. So like you mentioned, consulting, peer review, trying to help a colleague that's jammed on a difficult bug. And the thing that I think makes it transformative, as opposed to, say, screen sharing, is this notion of multitasking, right? So even if I find that if we are two people trying to debug something, and it doesn't matter if we're using Visual Studio Live Share or just two people sitting together on the same computer in the same room, sometimes it gets very fiddly, right? Because your idea of where you want to go explore might be different than the other person. The other person might hit step into, and you're still like, wait, how did we get here? Or the other person might hit step over, and you feel like, wait, no, I wanted to see what the value of that variable was before we stepped over this line of code. So that is what we are trying to address with the OzCode integration to live share. The idea that I can time travel to a particular point in time while the other person goes to a different point in time. And we give you a lot of actually extra functionality on top of that to enhance your time travel debugging experience. So for example, we see all these numeric indicators next to each branching operator here. So you see, for example, I see here that we entered the for each loop 30 times, and we entered the case clause 18 times, this case clause 18 times, and the other case clause 12 times. And whenever I hover over them, I see which are the customers that went into this case clause, and which are the customers that went into this case clause. Now, you see that of the 18 times we went inside of this case clause, we went 12 times into the if and 6 times into the else. And if I hover over this indicator, it shows me for each one of these 18 items, which were the ones where the if statement returned true on the item, and which ones are the ones where the if statement returned false on the item. So it makes it very easy for me to time travel and see the different iterations and get to the problematic case. Another way that I can time travel is by using any expression value as a pivot. So for example, here we see that we see the return value of customer.get email address. Now, if I hover over this and then hover over this numeric indicator, this shows me all the different values that the get email address method returned in the different iterations of this for each loop. And when I click on one of them, it shows me exactly, it time travels to that particular iteration, and again, shows me all the values which I can see by hovering over them, but they are the values that are relevant at that particular moment in time. To better illustrate this point about time travel fidelity, let's look at an example where you see how when I'm inside the OzCode time travel debugging mode, I get a completely different experience in terms of how the data tip appears. So you see that my breakpoint is still up here at the very beginning of this method. But when I hover over the value total price here, you see that it shows me the value, even though it's only initialized in this line of code. So if this was a normal debugging experience, the value of total price should be 0, because we didn't step through this line of code yet. But OzCode is already predicting everything that's going to happen inside this method. So now I see that the value of total price, when I hover over it here, it tells me it's 30. And we added the shipping cost, which is 21. So if I hover over total price here, it's telling me that the value was 51. So the on-hover data tip window actually has this notion of time travel fidelity. It shows me the value at the particular moment in time in which the value was calculated. So again, lots of interesting new scenarios for debugging when we have time travel enabled.
Yeah, so this is really, really nice because you don't have to change your context. You don't have to manipulate where exactly you are in the moment. You can just hover on the particular variable and you can see what was the value in this specific line of code. So yeah, I think this is very, very useful.
Right. So the last thing I'll show you just for dessert is again this idea of now using the entire code as an interactive live coding experience. So for example, you see that right here I'm taking the shipping, adding the shipping cost. Let's say I just decide to change this code. I multiply this by 100. Boom. As soon as I lift my finger from the keyboard, you see that this value is updated, but also this value is updated. Or if I now add here a call to a method that throws an exception, you see that, boom, now it immediately shows me in red, ooh, this method is going to throw an exception. One more example, if I change this code here so that the try parse will return false, so I add here some blah, 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 and again, as soon as I lift my finger from the keyboard, it updates and shows me, okay, now try parse is going to return false, so we are not going to go inside this if statement. So we combine time travel with live coding, and when you combine that with collaboration, you get a very, very exciting experience. Okay, so I think this about covers all the material I have for today.
Yep,
do we have any questions from the audience?
That we went through all the questions already. So okay. Yeah, Omer, I think that you just proved that everybody who is a C# developer need this tool, and if anybody experience problems with debugging, this is a must-have tool, and this is really nice. It has a lot of amazing features like debugging this link query, this searching for the specific information which you want to see. It's really, really nice tool, and I think that it will getting better and better. So I think that I'm keeping the finger crossed. And I think that this is definitely a tool which I will love to use, and yeah, this is something what I need to experience. So Omer, thanks very much for your time, for sharing with us your knowledge and your experience, and some awesome way how we can improve our debugging experience. It was really nice, very informative. So thanks once again. And I want to thank everybody who participated in our WROC Online webinar. I want to encourage you to fill the survey, which you can see in the video description below. So subscribe to our channel and see you next time.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure. Thank you for your time, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.